Greetings all! Yes, it is time for Q&A number 30, where I get to respond to questions posed to me by my Patreon supporters, with the occasional interesting one I may happen to find elsewhere, like on responses to earlier videos. First, a little bit of housekeeping. People are still commenting that YouTube isn't giving a notification when one of my videos drop. It's a little subsetting. If you just click the subscribe button, the bell will appear in white. If you click the drop down arrow next to it, it shows personalized by default. And that is a reflection of what the almighty algorithm thinks you should be watching. Given I tend to drop a video once a fortnight, it may not be enough for Al to think you're interested, given the amount of times that you click on my videos. So, click the all button, the bell will turn black, and you shouldn't miss too many more. So the big thing right now is that the sales of Plush emotional support missiles are now open and will be open for the next few days. So if you want your own guided missile surface attack MGM-51C, fire temperature -25 Fahrenheit to +145 Fahrenheit, this is your chance. Now, they don't do samples that go straight into production, but supposedly it's going to be a somewhat fuzzy ESM shape and about 9-10 inches long. I went with a company which can do a full-size ESMs if we want to, but we're going to start small. The process is simple enough. Put a $2 deposit down. One of two things will happen. Either there will be sufficient orders that the production run will occur, at which point the rest of the $33 will be charged and it enters production, or it won't. It looks like it'll actually take a couple of months to ship. Now, of course, if sufficient orders don't occur, well, the whole thing is cancelled and the $2 is returned to you. Shipping is worldwide, with obvious exceptions like North Korea or Russia. Anyway, we'll see what the demand is like. And to the questions, starting with Little Z. I remember seeing the video by Military History Visualized as to why the MG42 could not go into tanks. But the MG3 is very similar and can be mounted into tanks. What happened? Do they still change barrels? Is it a thicker barrel? Well, I won't spoil the full MHV video if you want to go check it out, but much of the problem revolves around the method of changing the barrel. Now, changing barrels isn't just an MG3 issue. A spare barrel comes in the Abrams for the M240/FN mag as well. However, in most cases, it's actually very rare for a barrel to have to be changed on an armored vehicle. Now, certainly there is the easy way to stop the problem. Just put two coax machine guns, such as on the AML. You shoot one, then you shoot the other while the first one cools down. However, the purpose of a modern coax is a little different from the purpose of a bipod-mounted infantry machine gun or even an old bow machine gun on a tank. A GPMG in an infantry platoon is primarily an area effect weapon and suppression weapon. If you hit something, great, and you do need to knock down targets to qualify with it. But the bottom line is you're creating a beaten zone, which means you have to send quite a few bullets downrange in order to create the desired effect. The coax machine gun on a modern tank, however, is a somewhat different kettle of fish. It is mounted in a very solid mounting, and the only beaten zone possibilities come depending on just how loosely it is mounted in the tank. And spoiler alert, in most tanks that's not very loose at all. As a result, the gunner is trained to create his own beaten zone by moving the controls, but it also means that, especially attached to a fire control system, the machine gun is more of an automatic sniper rifle. A short burst and you've either hit what you're aiming at or you've gotten sufficiently close that they're not voluntarily getting back up again for a moment or three. The chances of getting to the regulation 150 rounds of an MG3 sufficiently quickly that it's critical to change the barrel immediately are relatively low. If the barrel does need to be changed, on the MG3 there are a couple of differences with a World War II mounting. The first is that, frankly, there's a lot more room to play in. The crew positions may not be particularly larger than they were in World War II, but the gubbins inside the turret are much bigger. So finding the space to swing the coax barrel of an MG3 isn't really all that hard. Secondly, guns these days seem to be mounted a tad further back. For the Abrams, it's sufficiently far back that there's a special compartment called a smoke box for the gun to fit into so that the gases go forward instead of into the crew compartment. This also provides a little bit more space for the barrel to swing out. Tim Dalrymple. I happened to re-watch the snapshot of M3A1 with its cast hull and noticed the hull form is similar to that of Ram. Is there a connection between the two? Or would it simply been a product of what was around at that time? Well, Ram, though for some reason given an M4 designation, M4A5 if you're curious, was actually an M3 variant. Now remember, US tanks were very modular, and that components like hulls and engines could come from different manufacturers and they would all fit together. The early Ram tank upper hulls were cast by General Steel Castings before production was moved to Canada. And anything by General Steel, if you're curious, can be identified because they were cast their logo of a shield with a G on it. The M3A1 hull was cast by General Steel Castings. Now, I realize some sources indicate Alco, but that was more the assembly site, not the casting site. In any case, it seems reasonable to presume that a casting intended for a tank, which was going to fit on an M3 lower hull, is going to look fairly similar to a different casting intended for a tank, which is supposed to fit onto an M3 lower hull, from the same manufacturer. Thus, some similarities with an M3 casting are going to be a matter of form following function. Zaid. With the advent of jets and the development of the AN M3 caliber 50, and I appreciate you put it as caliber 50 in the question, which had a higher rate of fire, was there ever an attempt to mount these faster firing weapons on Shermans or Pershings? So I took a bit of a look and I could find no evidence of such an experiment. I'm not sure it was required anyway. I mean, the tank didn't really care very much about the weight of the heavy barrel for cooling for starters. Similarly, I could find no evidence of the Abrams with a 7.62 nor caliber 50 rotary cannon mounted. Now, of course, none of this is evidence of absence, and I actually could have sworn I'd once seen a minigun on the loader's skate ring once, but that may also be a case of Mandela effect. I see as many fictional hypothetical images and drawings as the rest of you guys do, so I'm a little reluctant to go all in on something I can't for the life of me find documentation on. Falling steel, what is a unity sight and how does it differ from a normal periscope? Unity, 1. It's a by 1 magnification, i.e. it has no effective magnification at all and the widest possible field of view. That's it. Now there are periscopes with sights which are magnified and there are those with sights which are not magnified. Well, those are your unity sights. Reichsbeerminister. What was the state of US Armor Branch in January of 1945? What lessons were learned? What was the state of tank design? Ooh, excellent question. Remember, Armor Branch didn't exist. Armored Force had been created, quote, for the purpose of service test. And thank you for giving me a question I can tackle next month. I'm about to head off to Fort Leavenworth for a good few weeks. It's a short sentence, I might get time off for good behavior. But in any case, it's going to be more mobile studio time due to the lack of other options and resources with things I can research with my online material that I'm bringing with me. So watch for that in a few weeks. And actually, on that subject, I'm sure Fort Leavenworth probably has a few things in the library I can look at as well. USA. Could the Germans have done a better job of supplying their allies with more capable and up-to-date tanks? In theory, yes, if they were willing to sacrifice their own force strength to do it. Germany never had enough tanks for itself as it was. It wasn't like the US, which had the capacity to fill both its own needs and the rest of the world. Don't forget, in addition to the tanks, the Germans would also have had to send logistical support. Now, when you're sending thousands of Shermans to the UK, you can afford to set up a supply line of spare parts and the like. Did the Axis really have the spare manpower and logistics trail to make use of the German vehicles which were provided in small numbers? I mean, for example, Hungary received, what, a dozen Tigers? And something like half were lost due to unrecoverable breakdowns. Possible spare parts issue. Engine 95. No, I'm actually not the best person to talk about for the Littlefield Panther's backstory. What you wrote in your question is about all I know at it. I'm more interested in the technical side. Con of class. What's the misfire drill for two-piece ammunition, such as on T-72 or Challenger? Now, I can't speak for the T-72 in detail, but the British 120mm, yes. If you have a think about just how a round is fired, you find that the system overall is not all that different to a regular unitary round. For the gun to go boom, there has to be an initiator, then detonation, or I guess technically a deflagration of the propellant. The initiator is set off electrically, both on the British and NATO standard guns. So, if the gunner pulls the trigger and the gun does not fire, the question is, did an electrical current even get as far as the initiator, the primer in a US round, the vent tube for the UK gun? The first possibility for that is, well, the trigger didn't work. Easily fixed by the commander trying his one. If that doesn't work, maybe there's an interlock. The gun isn't safe, either on the gunner's position or the loader's position. There is an auxiliary fire button on the gun mount as well for the British tank, if the regular circuits don't provide current. Maybe the battery-powered backup would fire it. If even that isn't doing it, well, maybe it's the firing pin not making a connection with the vent tube. If that works, well, the next thing is check the vent tube. The vent tube isn't, by the way, much over the size of a caliber 50. It's 0.625 inch or 14 millimeters or something like that is the official designation. There are actually two different designations. One's metric and one's imperial, depending on if you're looking at an L11 or an L30. No matter. Anyway, so this vent tube comes in 10 tube magazines, so it's very easy to replace this small thing. If the vent tube did initiate but the round didn't fire, then you're looking at a problem with the propellant. And that can be replaced because there's a bag to charge without removing the projectile. If you do have to remove the projectile for whatever reason, usually because you fired your last round and you loaded in a hurry, then you need to use the bell rammer and just push from the muzzle end out the breech. But there's no reason for that to happen as part of a misfire drill. However, the official misfire drill for Chieftain is online, and the actual sequence to check all these things is as follows. Pull trigger, nothing happens. Announce misfire. Check the firing needle assembly indicator pin to show there is a vent tube in place. If no vent tube is in place, put the next projectile back on the rack, because the standard procedure is that you grab the next projectile when you yell loaded. Stop yourself for not checking the vent tube, put the vent tubes back in the magazine, and start again. Now, if you check and the pin does show a vent tube is present, announce misfire, check the circuits and safeties, and also that the commander doesn't have its override on. If it still doesn't work, you go to emergency mode. The TC fires with the emergency button. Now, Challenger also has an auxiliary mode as well as an emergency mode, but same effect anyway. Just do both. You saw it in the Challenger video I did, that little button is inside the gun shield. If that doesn't work, supposedly you then wait 30 minutes before you futz with the breech rear. Now, whether you do that in combat, well, that's another matter. But anyway, so here's what you do next. Check the vent tube. If it's fired, you load a new propellant charge. If it didn't fire, you have to do a firing circuit check. If it passes, go back to square one with another vent tube. If it fails, replace the breech ring contact with the spare breech ring contact, and try again. If all that fails, the manual instructs the TC to call the remis. Why me 943? Is there any good single source covering the various T-series experimental vehicles of the USA during the World War II period? Yes. It's called Searching for Perfection by David Hoff. It covers 1925 to 1958. It starts at Car Armored Light T1 and it ends with Mortar T257E1. There you go. Has a short paragraph on each and a photograph on most. It isn't 100% comprehensive. I have found one or two omissions, but it does seem to have 99% of some 500 or 600 vehicles. Run on. Does the Army have a preference for 12, 24, 36 or higher voltage systems? Technically, it depends what circuit you're talking about. 6 volts wasn't unheard of in the older years, but 24 volts seems to have been the most common. Even the emergency firing circuit on the Challenger, that I mentioned just a moment ago, worked on a 24 volt system. Little Z. M8 Greyhound was originally designed to be a TD but became a recon vehicle. How would M24 Chaffee have performed the role of the M3 75mm gunmotor carriage? What vehicles would perform sufficiently in another vehicle's role, like the 3-inch on M10 doing artillery, such as the 105 M7 would do? Well, almost anything can be pressed into service as anything else. If M24 could be magically transported in time to when the M3 GMC was in service as a TD, it would doubtless do the job of the M3 better. Mostly better. You can make an argument about division from the open top. But the problem is it would be even better at doing the job of the M3 light tank. So that's where the people would put it. As for using Vehicle A for ersatz role B, well, pretty much anything is the same use as anything else. It just matters what inefficiencies you're willing to tolerate. M10 or Stug 3 weren't tanks, but performed well enough in the role that it was considered worth doing. M12 155mm self-propelled howitzer is an assault gun? Check. Striker ATGM in the assault gun role? Check. M10 Booker as a tank? On second thoughts, let's skip that one. You also ask about the 3-inch gun having more viable HE than the 76mm gun. I'm not sure I understand the question. The 3-inch and 76mm guns used exactly the same projectiles, so the HE effect will be identical. If you're talking about the 75 having a better HE effect, that's a factor with a lower velocity. Wookie Davidson. Thank you for the positive comments on the Black Horse videos. I actually had another series planned for another unit, but the DoD freeze on social media activity a couple of months ago killed it. I have yet to reschedule. How useful was Centaur OP? Did the Americans experiment with a similar concept? Sort of, but not really. There seem to have been two schools of thought on it. The British seemed to ditch the idea of OP tanks shortly after the war, but the Germans kept their Beobachtungspanzers, first out of the Jagdpanzerkanone and then Leopard 1s. The US took the third route. During the war, FOs were usually in a jeep, but being the US, they could also cheat with aerial artillery observation posts. Basically, security for them was to be found not in armor, but in being where almost nobody could shoot at you to begin with, i.e. several thousand feet up. Later, the M981 Fist V was an M113 variant almost identical to the 901 ITV, then replaced by the current service M7B Fist, which looks enough like a Bradley at first sight to be not so identifiable. What was the role of the M20 armored utility car? Two main purposes. One was to provide an APC for dismounts in a cavalry unit to work alongside the M8s. The other was it was a common command vehicle. Small, fast, armoured, with enough room inside without a roof for a few folks to work the radio sets. That's not to say that other work wasn't found for the M20s, but those were the two biggies. Grim. I have not read Proud Legions. Although, speaking of books, Tim Gunn has just put out a new anthology book. It's called The Graven Moon and Other Stories, complete with a Chieftain's Hatch, a cyber tank story. As for his other question, with the cancellation of the URCA and the switch to the SPH-M, do you feel it is perhaps better if the US Army purchases some off-the-shelf systems to fill any capability gap, perceived or not, until they can find a true replacement for the M109? Or do you think that the system is good enough to last for now? Okay, background for those of you not keeping track. The US Army has had about as much success at getting a new artillery piece as the US Marines had in replacing the AAV-7. The latter took about 5 decades, although the ACV has finally arrived. The first try for artillery was Crusader in 1994, cancelled when it was decided that that sort of requirement was no longer necessary in the post-Cold War era, and other priorities came to the fore. Next in 1999 was NLOS-C, which lasted about 10 years until the entire FCS program got nailed in 2009. There seems to be no huge hurry in the matter, as it was another 9 years before URCA, the Extended Range Cannon Artillery program, kicked off. That died about a year ago, and now we're going to the self-propelled howitzer modernization effort. Now, to my knowledge, URCA was never intended to fully replace M109 to begin with. It was a divisional or corps level asset, And even then, you'd only get maybe a battalion for every couple of DivArty and 109 battalions, at least in any theoretical exercises I saw. Which is fair. There's only so many targets which fit in between the requirements of what an M109 can reach and what an MLRS is suitable for. However, the extended range was useful. If you look at the standard Danovian order of battle, they have longer range artillery than we do. G6s, if you're curious. Plus, of course, the US likes to attack, which also gives an extended range requirement. The SPH-M schedule is very aggressive. They want initial trials early next year with an in-service date of 4 years after that. Now, if you compare that with the M10 timeline, it basically means what's on the shelf right now. So the idea of stopgapping with something until SPH-M arrives seems fairly irrelevant. M109A7 is still being fielded now, and if SPH-M were intended as a rush replacement for the M109, it seems unlikely that the army would continue to spend all the money buying A7s. So it seems to me that there is a specific capability gap which SPH-M is intended to fill. Not that anybody has shared that with me, but presumably that gap is range, as I can't think of any other benefits currently available systems would provide, such as multiple round simultaneous impact salvos, which wouldn't see a benefit from the entire fleet of M109s being replaced. If you only need a few battalions with that longer range, much as URCA seems to have been planned for, then it seems likely that M109A7, with whatever other additional upgrades are coming, will have a long and fruitful life yet. Little Z is getting greedy and has a bunch more questions, but I'm only going to take one more for now. I've seen diagrams of the arrowhead-like thrust used by the Germans at Kursk, with the Tigers at the top, the Panthers on the flanks, and regular Panzers in the middle. Wouldn't it make more sense if Tigers were at the flanks, since they got the stronger side armor, and the Panthers have more effective frontal armor? I don't think so. Imagine being the very front tank in that arrowhead. As you get closer to the front line to make that first small penetration, you were going to be subject to almost perpendicular flank shots, and crossing fire was a deliberate tactic used by the Soviets. Yes, in theory, the Panthers at the edges might find themselves taking flanking fire from guns which couldn't reach anything closer to the middle. But if the middle point of the attack doesn't make headway, then it doesn't really matter what happens on the wings, does it? Besides, it's also possible that the tanks in the middle turn to a flank and start rolling up the enemy line, so the guns on the far edges get a choice between the tanks to their front or the tanks also head on to their side. Adam Schindler. What technologies would enable a shift from primarily direct fire anti-tank weapons to primarily indirect fire anti-tank weapons? Is the level of technology or operator proficiency currently deployed in Ukraine sufficient to draw conclusions? I don't think it is, but the theory of indirect fire anti-tank weapons is already reality. It just hasn't been fielded as well. If you think about it, the idea of an indirect round capable of defeating a tank is some 30 years old. Sidearm was used in 2003. Rounds like bonus are being used now. So, since it's obviously a lot safer to shoot from an indirect position 20 kilometers away, why hasn't it become a default? Well, actually, if you think about it, if you look at the Korean round fired from the K2, I think it's like 6 kilometers away. But anyway, why isn't it the default? And the first is discrimination for prioritization. Sidearm or bonus can't really tell a tank from a PC. Can't really tell a live vehicle from a dead one. So overkill is a distinct possibility, with multiple rounds falling on one target, making it expensively inefficient. Now, there is a theory of brilliant munitions which can talk to each other on the way down and separate the targets out, but I'm not sure it's really gotten there yet. The real problem, though, for your typical indirect anti-tank fire from artillery is simply response time. Tube artillery is fast to get from A to B, but it still takes some time of flight. So to go 25 kilometers is over a minute, simply on time of flight. When we were in Afghanistan, we're doing 30-something kilometer rounds, and we're talking 2.5 minute times of flight. And then there's the entire call for fire process. So that's an awful long time for you in your foxhole or tank hatch to be waiting for the rounds to impact from when you first see the tank coming at you. Assuming that you haven't observed it already via drone, which I was also assuming that it's a drone acceptable environment and it doesn't get shot down. Combined arms is a thing. Anyway, if you have seen them and they're still on the move with the drone, then you still have the issue of trying to hit the moving target with artillery. And yes, this bonus round can aim a little bit, but how far is this thing going to move in a couple of minutes? Or not move? If as soon as you pull the trigger on the gun tube, suddenly the tank decides to stop moving. With a direct fire weapon, however, you have no particular delay. If you're in a tank, you can engage a target within 10 seconds. 30 seconds if you have a missile like a TOW. It's cheaper, it's discriminatory, and you don't need to rely on anybody else. Now, things actually get moving a little bit more interesting if you're going the other way, when you're attacking. The idea is that the defending unit is already attrited by the time your own direct fire assets, like tanks and Bradleys, make contact. If you're going to attrit a unit, it's probably going to be done by use of artillery. So if a tank battalion is at 35% strength, let's say, before the friendly tanks make contact, that means 65% of it has already been attrited by indirect fire or aviation. Then again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the tanks themselves have been attrited. Now, if the tanks are disabled due to blown tracks, optics, killed crewmen, etc., they're still not effective. So it's a win by the artillery. Mine Turtle, what are the top 5 engine decks to sleep on? M1 is definitely on that list. It's absent all the louvers or bumps found on lots of other tanks, and the turbine engine gets really, really hot, which means the engine deck stays cozy and warm all night. I would presume that number 2 on the list would be T80 for the same reason, although I'm not entirely sure about that. The M60 deck also has its smooth spots, but unfortunately the sleepable surface seems pretty small. Bradley, of course, has the advantage of the drop ramp. Now, every vehicle would have a block of wood. You could use it as a little rest, a little chalk, and that will keep the ramp horizontal for you to sleep on. Your question on how the Army handled procurement in World War II from private companies more or less is actually covered by my thesis, which itself seems like an easy thing for me to make a video on when I'm in for Leavenworth. Marcus Child, do you have a favorite MRE? Or most hated? Well, most hated is easy. Vegetable manicotti. I'm told it no longer is in production. Thank Christ. I'm happy enough with chili with beans. Which actually seems to imply the Army believes in the existence of chili without beans. Otherwise it wouldn't feel a need to specify. Which probably puts an official government end to that question. It's worth noting that I don't necessarily think the main meal is the be-all and end-all of MRE quality. Accompanying items and munchables are as important. Sometimes I'll eat those and leave the main course alone. I personally detest the cheese spreads and prefer the jams or peanut butter. The vegetable crackers were terrible, but I'm happy with the bread. Good munchables go in my pockets or web gear for consumption on the go. Also, I'd say some MREs are acceptable cold and some are acceptable only when heated. Watch out for that. Also, he wants to know, where do I find almond fingers? Tesco is usually a good bet, occasionally Spar. Apparently the things are also found in the Netherlands, known as Canoes. Mike Quinton, what's going to happen to the Abrams and Bradleys in outside storage, which will probably be never used again? Range targets, cannibalization, melted down? Good question. My understanding is that not all M1s are suitable for conversion to the current generation M1A2s. The older tanks, particularly the 105s, although I think early A1s also, apparently cannot be converted. So quite what the plan is to do something with them, I have absolutely no idea. I also have absolutely no idea how the modern armor is installed in them and if they can be removed by scrappers. Cannibalization seems unlikely, as few of the parts are going to be useful in a modern M1. The modern tanks are all digital, not analog. Suspension components are made for tanks 15 tons lighter, and so on. I suspect a good few will eventually end up in things like VFW Hall front yards. S-Face, assuming the country is not getting bombed, how long does it take to tool up and start producing tank or artillery ammunition or spare parts for vehicle? And part of the answer to that question is, how much money are you willing to throw at the problem? For example, I came across the history of the Racine, Wisconsin Massey Harris tank plant. The decision to build one somewhere in the Racine-Kenosha area was made in December 1941. The plant started fitting out 31st January 1942. They saved a little bit of time by using an old Nash automobile plant, which had shut down its Lafayette line 7 years earlier. The contract to build the tanks came 26th of February 1942. The first M5 was completed 9th of July 1942. Then they realized they'd forgotten to build a test track, and it sank into a swamp next to the factory on its maiden voyage. Now, there are all sorts of caveats to that sort of timeline. As for example, obviously the tank plant itself didn't build most of the components like the gun, engine, suspension, etc. This was an assembly facility. If you watch my video on the Quad Cities tank arsenal, you'll see the other end of the scale where there are so many problems getting the factory set up that it just becomes a disaster. But anyway, it'll give you an idea of some of the things you can do in a hurry if you really want to. A Turkish gamer. The Elbonian question, except 1993. I need to have a long, hard think about that one, because the long development timelines of modern equipment means that everything is much better thought out. I mean, the obvious answer is to buy shed loads of T-80Us and BMP-2s and 3s, but even then I'm not sure that actually works out, because those vehicles were reasonably sensibly designed for the needs and situation of their using armor and production systems. We don't have an Elbonian doctrine that I know of. They might be terrible vehicles for the West Germans or British perhaps, but they have their place in the Soviet military. Hack jobs like Jagdtiger or stopgaps like Comet don't really seem to have been much of a thing in the 1980s. I'll have to think about it over the coming while, but I really don't know if this question is answerable. C. McKay, Akara, congratulations on your new command. Margaret. For those who don't know, I am now the commander of 1st Squadron, 124th Cavalry, the Mars Men. Last horse cav unit in the army, and almost unheard of because few people care about the Burma campaign, and those who have are far more familiar with Merrill's Marauders than their successors, the Mars Task Force. There was a thesis written back a couple of years ago entitled "The Most Forgotten Unit in the Most Forgotten Theatre of That War." But they did do well enough that Mars Men is categorized by the Army as a special designation. It's probably worth my doing a video on that as it is. But anyway, it's kind of weird. Every time I go to a new unit, there's usually somebody there who watches my material. It's always a little bit awkward, a little bit sometimes. My favorite, we were sitting down, we were doing a Bradley, it's always a tank net was happening. One of the, a net is new equipment training. And I swung by the motor pool and some E7, I think it was, comes up. It just happens to see me. Chieftain! I look at my rank insignia, I look at his rank insignia, look at my rank insignia again. Yeah, but it's sir. Had an exercise in Indiana last year, a big multi-division exercise, and quite a few people out there knew me. It's got people coming up to me. You don't know if it's going to be a fan or if it's going to be somebody wanting to help you kill somebody. The troubles and travails of a YouTuber. It also happens actually, one of my new first sergeants has a YouTube channel. He's doing fairly well, 20-odd thousand viewers. His is on slot machines. What was it? Low limit, high slots. I'll put a link to it down below if you're interested in slot machines. Anyway, his question. When shunting trains, switching in American, there are specific rulebook signals, hand by day, lamp by night, that the person in charge of the movement makes to the driver to direct them to move forwards, reverse, slow down, stop, etc. Are there similar rulebook signals for directing tanks or AFVs that both driver and person on the ground need to know and follow? Absolutely. Now, I don't know what the standards are for other countries, and they do differ from country to country because, for example, I've discovered that the Irish and US armies have different standards for directing wheeled vehicles, for example. They also, it turns out, have different standards for clearing the M240 and FN MAG, which caused me some hassle at the beginning of my US military career. But anyway, for the US, look up TC3-21.60 visual signals. It replaces the old FM 21-60, but pretty much all the signals for vehicle guiding remain the same. And one thing I like about this manual is that it seems to be one of the last vestiges in the US military of the distinction between a pivot steer and a neutral steer. It's a gripe of mine that because the gear selector for neutral steer is labeled pivot on Abrams and Bradley, that US soldiers think the actual maneuver is called pivot steering. Doubtless they will be confused by the pivot steer levers on older M113s, but go to 2-19 and there you go, neutral steer. White Sagittarius. Considering the Israelis upgraded the Sherman to be able to fight mid-Cold War tanks, would it be possible to follow a similar upgrade path to get Panzer IV to a similar level? I doubt it. Unlike Sherman, Panzer IV is a purely pre-war design, and it was already pretty much at its limits and overweight by 1945. Panzer IV's turret also had a pretty solid limit on the length of the recoil stroke caused by the TC being in the line of recoil. They would have to entirely rebuild the turret to get them to fit in the turret originally spec'd for a low velocity 7.5cm gun, trying to fit a higher power cannon. I think the best answer would have been to convert them to something like the Irish attempt to update a Comet, called the Headless Coachman. You remove the turret entirely and replace the weapon system with a recoilless rifle or pedestal mounted gun or some such. John Cryer. What's the chances M10 will actually enter battalion service? Pretty good, I think. Certainly Armour Branch is reconfiguring itself on the basis of the M10 battalions. Now I do hope to go back to the army later this year and check up on a production model as opposed to the pre-production prototype I covered earlier, but we'll see. Brando, what was on my Thanksgiving plate? Are there any special foods I look forward to? Nope, not really. I suffer through Thanksgiving. It's more something that my wife is into. Now I prefer ham over turkey. I'm fine with the stuffing or mashed potatoes. Brando also wants to inquire about the caliber 50 M3 for some reason, except this time he's now asking about other vehicles such as the M16 GMC. And again, I can't think of any instance in which it was tried, and I don't see any reason for it, especially on the M16. You already have the rate of fire of 4 caliber 50s. How many more rounds do you need to send down range? The weight of 4 guns versus one fast firing one is much less of a factor on a half-track than it is on an aircraft, and if there's a stoppage on an M2, whatever, you have another 3. John Rayberger. What do I see now and in the near future as the most effective defense against drones for armored vehicles? Right now, I'd say SPA. Active protection systems have been demonstrated as being capable against drones which impact or at least come very close to the vehicle, but of course it doesn't help against those which hover at 50 meters. Neither does it help much against drones armed with nothing but a camera, which are a mile away. EW is not going to affect fiber optic equipped drones, though I hate to think about the miles of fiber optic cable that kind of will end up strewn around the battlefield. A dedicated anti-aircraft vehicle like Stout is able to protect a number of other vehicles, much cheaper than giving them all an active protection system, and of course personnel in the area who can't carry an active protection system. The little M5 RCV I showed back a couple of years ago, especially if given an AI like a wingman, could do a similar job. That leaves active interception, such as 30 to 40mm ammunition or directed energy weapons. The really big problem, I think, is going to be figuring out whose quadcopter is whose to shoot at. Airspace management is going to be a really tough nut to crack. Iron Akela. At what level of formation would an ACR be attached? I've seen conflicting information that the screen for an armoured division would be either an entire ACR or a cavalry squadron. A division's recon unit was the DivCav squadron. It's a reinforced battalion-sized organisation which at the time they went away consisted of a couple of companies of armour and a couple of companies of helicopters. The ACR, Armoured Cavalry Regiment, was an extremely powerful and mobile force for the size, just as long as what you needed it to do didn't require many dismounts, and it was assigned to corps. These days, a brigade combat team is normally given the corps job. The reality is, Although almost everyone thinks it's a good idea to bring the ACRs back, the resources are simply not there to make one. Better to have a general purpose BCT than a specialized ACR given the size of our army today. New AFV development by several militaries seems to indicate an increase in main gun caliber, 130 or 140 for tanks, 35 to 50 for IFVs. Is there a need for these firepower upgrades? It seems not in terms of the tank. Anyway, the M1E3 is not moving to anything more than the 120. The US is firmly convinced that what it has is sufficient for the reasonably future needs. Similarly, the recent order by Italy for KF-51 seems to indicate that it will modify the design to retain the 120mm. For the IFV, however, there is an argument. Modern fusing is far more capable than it was back in the 25mm days, and the effort and expense of programmable fusing into IFV AG rounds is worth it. However, to take advantage of those capabilities, you need to have a big enough explosive charge and fragmentation to go with it. Plus, there also becomes a point of diminishing returns, if not a hard limit, when it comes to the cost of putting such a fuse into every one of the 1,200 or so 25mm rounds in a Bradley, or the simple ability to miniaturize it to the extent that it will even fit into a 25 or 30mm round. Perron's recent coverage of Cadets showed some next-gen tanks with drones and other systems built in. Would these be worthwhile additions in your opinion, or extraneous uses of weight and space? I can certainly see a tethered drone, with a large caveat called AI. Nothing wrong with having additional situational awareness, but no crewmen have the time to fly the thing. So effectively you're turning the drone into a mast-mounted sight, and that's reasonable enough, with the AI moving the drone to keep station with the tank, and a tether freeing up the EM spectrum, not providing a signal out to the outside world, and also allowing constant power transfer from the tank. The other part of the AI is the use of the AI to identify what is being seen and to integrate it into the other information sources that the tank has and present that as a processed amalgamation to the crew. Not that the TC shouldn't be able to just punch up directly what is being seen by the camera, but it shouldn't be required that the crew keep eyes permanently glued to that screen and then figure out what it's looking at. So go back to my Designing the Tank of the Future video for more on that. I am not a fan of sticking missiles or other loitering munitions into a tank, however. It takes room for systems which can be launched by other platforms. Alexander H. What's my take on the Boxer RCH-155 howitzer? I'm not sure I have one. I've not seen one in the flesh. I'm not entirely convinced on wheels versus tracks, and fire on the move seems a little bit silly considering how quickly it can get going again after firing compared to the risk to accuracy. But overall, it seems like an extremely capable piece of kit, which will be very hard to counter battery. There are doubtless, however, a whole slew of technical characteristics which only artillery design engineers and operators can understand, which aren't covered by the flashy sales brochures or videos. I guess we'll just see how well it does in the SPH-M contest. I'll be shocked if it's not entered. Caleb Inglehart. Aside from a certain pitch fruit beginning with letter A, what other superstitions are there amongst tank crews? The big one is feeding the turret monster. You drop a sacrificial offering before you do something important in the hopes that the monster's hunger will be sated and thus it will not eat something critical that you need later. What do tank crews get up to when they're bored? I do remember doing a drag race in Iraq. But realistically, there's nothing particularly unique about tank crews there. There's always an inherent risk in letting Joe get bored. And I have no doubt that any soldier, regardless of branch, can get up to shenanigans. Felicity Longus, what was the true effectiveness of World War II aircraft in the anti-armor roles? You need to go back in time many, many years to my Myths of American Armor video. Go to myth number 9. Western aircraft sucked at killing tanks directly. They were very important in defeating armored units. There's a difference. He also wants to know, what was the M70H sight for? It does seem to be a rare one. It was used with the 76mm gun and was mounted in both M4 and M18. It looks like the M18s more commonly mounted the M76C and the M4 more commonly the M71D. I suspect, though I cannot confirm offhand, that the M70H, given that most M70s were for the 75mm, was an early optic which was later replaced by more purpose-designed sights. He also has the temerity, the sheer gall, to, well, actually, me on something I said on the previous Q&A, that the M36 destroyed by the 155mm HEP round was, in fact, a T-72. Why did I say M36? Well, because that's exactly what the caption said. However, upon closer reflection, the man has a point. T-72 was the attempt to re-gun the M10 with the 76mm gun. It used a thinned down version of the T-23 turret. I have 4 pages of it in my book, which, if you are not aware that I have a book, I do! It's called Can Openers. Plug. Anyway, 2 of the vehicles were built. After the T-72 program was terminated, it had the mount removed and it was used as a test bed for a non-recoiling gun, both in 75mm and 76mm flavors. Where the thing ended up after that does not seem to be easily found. So, arguments in favor of this being a T-72 are found front and back. The bustle on T-72 was a simple rectangular box. The bustle on M36 was a more triangular pyramidal sort of shape. Further, the aft end of the M36's curve had a curve. But this photograph, it's impossible to state really if a curve exists. On the front end, that is very definitely a 76mm mantlet, not a 90mm. On the other hand, the lifting eye on the front slope of the turret seems perpendicular to the gun, like an M36, as opposed to being in line with it on T-72, and there are no visible lifting eyes on the rear side of the turret, as there are on T-72. Plus there's that weird double bulge on the left side of the turret. Prototype M36s had a bulge on the left side for a caliber 50. This bulge never made it to production models. Also, the color of the mantlet seems sufficiently different that maybe it was a post-facto mounting. That does not explain the back end, though. So back I went to the report to see if I could find any other clues. And this is the clincher. The blown away backplate seems to be square, and look at those 2 stowage points on the turret wall just above the turret ring. Thus, Felicity Londis is correct. The vehicle is actually T-72, and it means that the Army accidentally destroyed a very rare vehicle. Then again, it was likely to get destroyed eventually anyway, given they seemed happy enough to use it as a backstop for gunnery tests. I think the minor detail differences in the turret can possibly be explained away by the fact that 2 of the vehicles were built, and as far as I know, I've only seen photos of one of them. The other might have been slightly tweaked, which was not unusual between the first couple of prototypes in World War II. It's also possible that the armor on that double bulge was bent by other damage. So, congratulations, Mr. or Ms. Londis, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. I would have stayed in ignorance otherwise. Good catch. Captain Tanker Joe. What was the story of the Vietnam War tank crewman? Dangerous. You will recall, of course, that US tank crew casualties in World War II were stupidly low as an overall percentage of those sent overseas, particularly when compared to, say, riflemen or engineers. However, in Vietnam, 11 Echoes, which were the old MOS for tankers, were the highest casualty rate of any MOS. 27% of tankers assigned to Vietnam ended up dead. Interesting, considering the supposed vulnerability of Sherman to German weapons and the relative invulnerability of M48 to Vietnamese ones. Granted, there is Sheridan. That said, Bruce Cameron's book, Canister on Fire, lists by name every crewman who got into a Centurion in Vietnam. There are 760 names, of which 75 were wounded and 6 killed, making a less than 1% fatality rate. Now, there could of course be any number of reasons for the differences, but it just goes to show that the actual experience of any individual tanker in Vietnam could vary. However, it's a good question, and there are lots of answers to it on the web. Still, since there are Vietnam tankers still with us, why don't I do this? I sat down with a good long conversation with a couple of World War II tankers, Tom Sater and Clarence Smoyer, but I haven't done it with anybody from Vietnam. If you have somebody that you're willing to put in front of a camera with me, and who you think would be a good storyteller, drop me a line. Right, that'll about do it. Again, I do plan on recording those 2 videos I mentioned over the coming weeks, so hopefully there isn't a drop in cadence while the Army has me otherwise engaged, but no promises. Anyway, I hope you found it all interesting and informative. I'll talk to you in the next one. Don't forget to turn that bell black instead of white, and go buy yourself an emotional support missile. All right, take care.